How do our words, decisions, and exercises shape patient recovery? Today, we are exploring how clinical interactions, language, and exercise prescription influence patient beliefs, perceptions, and outcomes, areas that are often overlooked but critical for effective pain management. Our guest is Brendan Mouatt, an exercise physiologist and CEO of the Neuroorthopedic Institute, NOI Group. Brendan has over 10 years of experience directing private practices, delivering international continuing education, and researching how clinical interactions and perceptions influence recovery. He is passionate about translating research into practical strategies that improve patient engagement and outcomes. I'm Ariana Parks, physical therapist, and this is PT Pro Talk, where leading clinicians share practical insights to elevate your practice. By the end of this episode, you'll understand how to communicate more effectively with patients, avoid unintentionally reinforcing fear, optimize exercise prescription to support engagement and recovery, and translate evidence into everyday clinical practice. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. Now let's dive into today's discussion. PT Pro Talk is only possible with the support of the forward-looking and innovative companies like Sarah Health. Remote therapeutic monitoring sounds great, but also difficult. Sarah Health makes RTM simple and easy for your patients and providers. Check out sarahealth.com/PTProTalk for a special offer. Hi, Brendan. Welcome to PT Pro Talk. How are you today?
I'm great. Thanks for having me, Mariana.
Awesome. So let's get started just talking a little bit about yourself and your background.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm based in Adelaide, Australia, also known as Ghana country, to the local Indigenous people. But I sort of grew up all over Australia. I am an exercise physiologist, so I did a Bachelor of Exercise Science many years ago, and then did my clinical Masters of Exercise Physiology and worked in that space. Working in sort of neurological, musculoskeletal, and metabolic conditions, and then really sort of developed this interest in working with pain and in musculoskeletal populations. And so that was what I was primarily working with. And I guess given that interest, I think there were a lot of things that I had learned through that process of my education and my continuing education, where when I started to read more research, it really contradicted what I had learned in many ways. So I'd seen these things work in clinical practice, but the literature wasn't supporting that it was working for the reasons that I thought it was working. And for me, it was quite a nice, interesting journey to really engage with that literature and try and figure out better explanations for what it was that I was seeing in clinical practice and why some people were getting better, some people weren't. And that interest, I guess, in research sort of brought me back into wanting to go into the research field as well. So although I still clinically practice a small amount now, I went back and did my Masters of Research as well as onto my doctorate research as well, which I'm finishing off now. And that's kind of where I am at this point. And I'm also the CEO at NOI Group as well. So looking after sort of pain education and finding ways to better translate research into clinical practice and for those who need it most. And so there's sort of a real passion for that education of these ideas and the communication of it to get to the people who need it.
Quick pause to share something exciting. I've been working on a new tool for prescribing home exercise programs that fixes a lot of the frustrations PTs have shared with me. You can upload your own videos, update plans anytime without creating new links, and share them instantaneously. No apps, no patient logins. You can even see how often patients open their exercises. If you're curious and want early updates, join the interest list using the link in the show notes. All right, let's get back to the conversation. Very good, very good. And that's what we're going to try to do today. Try to make it practical, right? We were just talking about that. So you're going to discuss how the way we communicate and prescribe exercise can influence the patient's belief, perceptions, and outcomes, right? So you're just mentioning your masters. So tell us a little bit about what your master's was about, and your results, and what is those difficult words that you have there. Inter. Let's see if I'm gonna even pronounce it right. Interoceptive and exteroceptive information,
Yeah. Yeah.
and how that affects perception. So just tell us about what was your master's about.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds super technical, but we could make it a little bit more simple than that. Essentially, my master's was around people that there were healthy populations we were looking at. And we're looking at virtual reality and how virtual reality was helping people to engage, motivate, influence their affect, so their emotional response to exercise. And so we did a sort of a scoping review to look at what the literature was around virtual reality and exercise in those contexts. But one of the studies that we did was looking sort of at perception and whether or not we could influence the way people perceived their body during exercise and how hard they were working during exercise using visual deceptive cues in virtual reality. And so what we did in this one particular study is that we had people riding in virtual reality, and they wrote in 3 conditions at separate times. And the first condition, or they were randomized, but there was a flat condition, so they'd ride for 10 minutes in a flat condition, or they would be riding in a condition where they'd be riding uphills interspersed with flats, or they'd be riding in downhills interspersed with flats. Unbeknownst to them, we weren't changing the resistance on the stationary bike that they were riding on at all. So they thought, that this would be responding to what they would be doing in the virtual reality, but we didn't change that. And the one other thing that we measured was their interoceptive accuracy. Now, interoception, like you said before, interoception is just the sensory information coming from within our body. And our interoceptive accuracy is how well we can detect that. So we've got some kind of crude ways of measuring that in research to look at how in tune someone is to their bodily cues, how hard their muscles are working, how hard their heart is working, how their condition of their gut and everything else that might be happening within their body. And then we've got exteroceptive information, and exteroceptive information is just a fancy word for information coming from outside, from within our environment. And so that's the virtual reality, that visual sensory information that we were manipulating in this particular study. And so what we found in this particular study is that there was this sort of interaction between how good someone was at detecting their internal bodily sensory information and how they felt during exercise and how they would use that exteroceptive information, that visual sensory information. So basically what we saw is if they had really good interoceptive accuracy, so good body awareness, then they were less influenced by what they saw. Okay, they were in tune with, this is how hard my body is working, and they were more likely to pick up that resistance of the bike wasn't changing. However, those who had lesser interoceptive accuracy, so less ability to detect what their body was doing, they biased that exteroceptive information, what they visually saw, a lot more. And so if they were seeing themselves riding up a hill, they didn't feel themselves working harder. They had this prior expectation that they should be working harder, but there's this big mismatch in what's going on. And so they actually feel like there's almost a motor on the back of the bike kind of pushing themselves up this hill. But then we saw the opposite happen for the condition where they're riding downhills. What's our expectation for riding downhills? We expect it to get more difficult, and it doesn't get more difficult, but we're using this sensory information in this group, and all of a sudden it feels significantly harder than what you'd expect. And so what we saw in those people is that their ratings of perceived exertion were significantly higher. It grew a lot higher, even though they were still working at that same cycling rate that they were in all of the other conditions as well. So what this really told us was essentially we are using more than just the sensory information coming from within our body. We're using all of the sensory information available to us to construct how we should feel, and that should help us to regulate our homeostatic control. If we feel worse, or we feel like we're exerting ourselves, then we can change our behavior to make sure that we stay within those homeostatic bounds and live to fight another day. Okay, except in this study, we wouldn't let people change how hard they were working. We had to torture them further. And I think it was this research for me that really was the foundation for my PhD in terms of what's happening in the clinical interaction. What are the different exteroceptive bits of information and interoceptive bits of information during clinical interactions that are really shaping that patient's perception of their body, their ability, their capacity to do things within their environment, and the way that they would engage in healthcare in the future
Mm-hmm.
as well.
Mm-hmm.
So those kind of complex interactions of what we as clinicians might be telling them, but also what we might be doing and how that is interacting with this complex interplay of experience.
Mm-hmm. So that first year master's is just to make you feel a little more curious to continue researching further, and then you start your PhD. And do you have some answers for us? So like how those, the clinical interactions, approaches, our decisions, the words we use, um, how they, impact the patient's feeling and ability to, beliefs and perceptions. Do you have anything that you can share with us?
Yeah, I can share a bit. Probably not all of the details, as some of them are either under review or about to be submitted for publication. But what we're seeing is, and I don't think this would be something that would be mind shattering for any of your listeners either, is that we definitely see that what we say and the words we use really, really do matter. And so that's the first part there is uh, words have long lasting effects. And the way we talk about health, the way we communicate what it is that might be going on for them, the explanations for why we might be doing some type of manual therapy or exercise or one of many other interventions we might be using, why we might be referring off to another healthcare practitioner. The way that's structured, the way we consider the words we use, but even the metaphors that might be underpinning that. We talk a lot in metaphors as human beings. That all looks to have a really profound effects in how that person is going to perceive themselves in terms of, do they feel like they're fragile, or do they feel like they're adaptable and can be nudged in the right direction where they continue to adapt. And when we look at the qualitative research with people with ongoing pain complaints, you just need to read just a few of the quotes in those papers, and you see, as a big whole, the quotes are reflecting this fragility of the body. Very rarely do we see notions of bioplasticity, where if we are faced with some uncertainty, if we're faced with some challenges, that we can actually adapt if we're hitting that right amount, that sweet zone of challenge. And so I think language obviously plays a really large part in how we might be, reinforcing that fragility, or how we might be starting to open people up to this idea of adaptability and bioplasticity. And then equally so, what we're finding is that it's not just what we say. We can't just say whatever we want and say all the good things and then just do whatever we want. It's becoming really apparent in our work that what we say needs to also come through in what we do. That congruency between those messages of bioplasticity and adaptability and recovery needs to also be consistent with the treatments and the ways that we approach those treatments as well. And so maybe to give a bit of an example of what I mean by that is we could maybe provide the most lovely explanation to them about what's going on and how they're going to go through these stages of healing and that they can maybe make a full recovery, et cetera, et cetera. Some really nice notions around pain science education. We can be sore but safe and so on. But then we might lie them down on our table and then we look for this really specific anatomical feature of what's going on and apply a very specific treatment to that area. They might feel better after that. But that sense making for that individual is going, hang on a second, they said that I'm safe to move, but then they did something very specific to my back or my knee or my foot or whatever it might have been, very, very specific. And I felt better afterwards. There's clearly something very specific wrong with my body that can go out that could maybe be put back into place with, a mobilization or some sort of hands-on or a very specific exercise that is targeting that area. And so what we're saying here is that the sense making for an individual doesn't come just from what they hear from us, but also their sense making around what that treatment is doing and what that means based on all of their previous experiences as well. And so I think it's just important here to note that it's not to say that we shouldn't be doing any sort of specific exercises or specific manual therapy treatments at times, but it's to consider how that is being made sense of by that individual in that clinical interaction.
Hmm. Would it, for example, if you do like an manual therapy or a very specific, maybe more passive, way of helping them gain mobility, could you just explain, these manual therapy or whatever pressure, over pressure I'm doing in this exercise or movement or mobilization is to help you gain mobility so you can do the exercise yourself, for example? Like, how would you give them an explanation to kind of, bring them back on track on being active, empowering them, even though if you need to use, for example, specific modalities or something like that in the beginning for, to allow them to then be able to be more empowered and self-treat and do the exercises and all of that.
Yeah, absolutely, Mariana. I think what you've touched on there is, an integral part to it. Just giving these good explanations to begin with, but I think then also having that conversation with them about what treatments they've had before, and if they've had this treatment before as well, then that's a great opportunity to have a chat about what do you think. So when you had that experience before, what was it that you think was being done? How do you think that was helping you? Why do you think that was something that was being used? So just being able to kind of capture their sense making already of that process and then being able to kind of dig a little bit deeper and maybe providing a few extra layers of education to why that might be the case. So that'd be probably number one. It's just going a bit deeper and not just assuming that what we say is being taken on board and uh, being used in that sense making process as the most reliable part of the information. Because experience is so important in that. And their previous experience as well is going to be really influential in how they're constructing and making sense of this clinical interaction. And then the second part, I think, is for us to just reflect on the treatments and strategies we're using and going, right now, is this going to be the best way to get them to engage in the active strategies that we think are going to be really beneficial for them, if that's what we're aiming to do for that individual? Or is this creating a barrier that we're going to have to try and hurdle over and work harder to get them into the active strategies later on? Is there a way here that we can bypass that in a way where we can make them feel safe without having to do that? And a lot of the time that might not be the case at all. But it's just asking that question and really reflecting hard on, hey, is there another way here where we can make sure they've got some really clear sense making that's going to move them in that trajectory of active strategies that they have control of, that they develop that self-efficacy for, and can move forward with their
Mm-hmm.
life.
Mm-hmm. And to make it more practical, would you have like examples of language that we should avoid using?
I think it's a bit context dependent. So I don't like putting necessarily blanket rules over things, but I think there are some language that I have in my own practice sort of just taken out of my vocabulary or worked hard to take out of my vocabulary. And as an exercise physiologist, I'm obviously quite biased to using exercise as a strategy, but I think exercise can be used very, very passively as well. Just as a side note there as well, it's often seen as an always active intervention, but I think it can be prescribed so passively to people.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but so in the exercise context, words like stability, I think are really loaded. Talking about very specific anatomical structures, I try to reduce that unless it's very clinically relevant to their situation. So talking about the core, I tend to try and reduce that sort of language as much as I can. Stability, core
Mm-hmm.
stability, that sort of thing. Because if we're doing a core stability exercise, is there sense making from that sort of language that, you know, that we're doing this because my spine's unstable? And then if they think their spine's unstable, are they even maybe unconsciously bracing a little bit more, avoiding certain movements, being hyper vigilant in their movements, unneedingly so? So I think language like that we can completely remove from our vocabulary, and we could still be doing those same exercises and still getting all the benefits out of that. Um, when I sort of just touched on before about mentioning specific anatomical parts of the body, at times, yes, it makes sense that in our education, when there is an acute injury, a clear musculoskeletal complaint where that individual, we can see that they will get some benefit from the education, from just understanding what it is that's going on and what, maybe the stages of healing and so on, then I think that's great. But otherwise, particularly in persisting pain conditions, talking about specific parts of the body in depth, I think starts to ingrain that there's these sort of specific parts of the body that go wrong. And it leads us down to potentially looking at the body through more a reductionistic lens rather than being able to step back and look at that whole person. So we kind of lose the ability to focus on the big picture, their values, the things they want to get back to, that
Mm-hmm.
look to be in the literature far better ways of focusing ourselves and orientating ourselves than focusing on, can we get that solace to start working in the way that we decided in our own clinical education.
Mm-hmm. And then going back to that stability in the car, we know that a lot of patients believe like that's how they, gonna avoid back pain and all of that. So what other words do you use to communicate that when you are like prescribing an exercise? So do you know any examples of what would be a good language to use instead?
Oh, look, it's almost sort of showing an exercise and just talking through. Let's try some of these exercises, um, and sort of show them and go, how does that feel to you? Reflect on the experience for them, rather than giving really specific explanations. Going, what we're doing here. I mean, one of the tools that I absolutely love that comes from the NOI Group content is using the sweet zone. And it's not a new concept either, but trying to find, the right amount of uncertainty, the right amount of challenge for that individual where it allows them, their system, to kind of be nudged in that direction of adaptability. And that'll usually be sort of my underpinning story quite often of why we might be trying some of these activities and movements, and
Mm-hmm.
being really quite general about them, but also having them, general in nature, just not specific to
Mm-hmm.
an area of the body, an anatomically specific thing, but specific to their tolerance, to their valued activities that they want to be getting back to their opportunities and within their barriers to be able to engage with this particular activity. And so it's usually couched in those principles of, all right, are you open to trying some of these, movements? Let's have a look at how you go with this. All right. Rather than having that traditional, okay, we're going to do this because this is, going to address your spine stability.
Mm-hmm. I think sometimes we explain too much. We are trying,
Mm.
give too much information. We want to explain our rationale why we are doing this, and um, because we think that it's important for the patient to understand that, to have the buy-in. But sometimes too much information, it's just overwhelming the patient. We never know how they're gonna take it, because for us, all the language is very natural. It's our day to day, but for them can be scary and have like a different impact that sometimes you don't even consider.
Well, yeah, no, I think it's such a good point, isn't it? We do feel, as a whole, speaking very generally about our professions here, is this need to try and justify everything that we're doing. And I don't think we should be going out and just doing whatever we want either. But I think when we're talking about this sense making of this individual and touching on this idea that they're making sense not just from what we say, but what we do, what they do as well, is that we can kind of step back, and if we set up the constraints to make sure that they're safe and that they can explore certain movements, activities, whatever it is that we think is appropriate for them, without giving them too much information, it allows them a little bit more freedom and opportunity to start to consider in their own mind what is going on for them, what's going to be useful and what's not, without us being, I guess, so paternalistic in our approach. But where afterwards we can kind of reflect together. We can sit beside them and say, when you were doing this particular activity, you said you're really worried about that, but you seem to be okay doing it in this. What do you think was going on? How was that for you? Would you
Mm-hmm.
like to understand a little bit more about what's going on? And that can really open up then those conversations to help guide that sense making,
Mm-hmm.
help justify and creating the rationales to the right amount for that individual without getting too far ahead of ourselves. And so I think that can be a nice way to go about it. I think some people do need those explanations up front, but I think we can also create flip it on its head, if you will, where they explore first and then we help kind of guide that sense making afterwards.
Mm-hmm. And like any other like practical ways that clinicians, um, you know, can can positively influence their patients and create like a safe, as you said, like a safe environment. So do you have any tips on how to help provide them to the patient?
I think there's a million ways we can do this, and one of the things that I think we've learnt from our particular research is that everything matters, and that can be from their first interaction with your website or on social media, in terms of what you're putting out there, the language you're using. Are you creating some sort of hope, or are you instilling fear in them before they even walk in the door? And I can say with our clinical practices early on, we were probably creating a fair bit of fear and then trying to sort of address that fear. So, and I mean, that's marketing 101, isn't it? Create a problem so that you can fix it. But that's not healthcare at all. That's quite problematic. And so we really struggled with trying to change that. And so I think we can reflect on our websites, we can reflect on that social media that we're putting out there. We can look at that first interaction as they're coming in through, the clinic doors. Are they coming into a room that's full of, spine models with little disc bulges on them, showing all the things that go wrong with the body? Or are they coming in and seeing an environment that shows how adaptable the body can be and how things can change, that there's hope here? And I think that in itself is creating this safety that can be so influential in that the way that they're going to engage with you in your sessions, but also with healthcare moving forward, potentially in the long term, in far more healthy ways. So I think right from there is where it starts. But then in the clinic room as well, I think it's really important that we kind of find ways to ensure that we're listening to what's going on. We're not just pinpointing on what's the thing that is going wrong in the body. Where are all of the other opportunities here? Where is the safety? What are all the great things they're already doing? Leveraging those things. So really layering in and making it clear where they've already got a lot of safety. They're doing lots of good things. Acknowledging where they've got these uncertainties. And then from there, trying to really de-threaten anything where there is clear safety, but they're not aware of it. And then the things where you're kind of going, all right, but here are the next steps, really making that clear and finding ways to now start nudging into a bit of that threat, a little bit of that worry, a little bit of that concern in these safe contexts, safe spaces that we've created.
Mm-hmm. And then regarding exercise, you mentioned not being so specific, right, at the beginning. So, like in general, do you tend to give more, general exercise versus specific? I know it depends on the patient, but like in talking about that sense that you don't want them to think anatomically and give like those kind of explanations, would that change the way you prescribe exercise?
Yeah, totally, and it does depend, like you said, in the sense that there are times where we will be a little bit more anatomically specific early on with a musculoskeletal complaint, but with persisting ongoing conditions, what we find is people are thinking very reductionistic. As a whole, on average, when they're coming to see us already, when they're being exposed to social media, their family, um, things they've been told before from other healthcare practitioners, they're already really anatomically, reductionistically focused in on that one thing that's going wrong with their body. And I think that can really limit those opportunities that we've got to engage with them, to start nudging this whole person system in the right direction as well. Um, Andrew Natoli, we did this paper. He led the paper, and it was looking at people with chronic low back pain, and basically just getting their um, understanding, interpretation of how safe and how beneficial different exercises were. So they just looked at different exercises with no explanation about them whatsoever to see what was their response to that. And what we saw was if there was sort of any spinal flexion or external load, people tended to perceive those exercises as more threatening and dangerous, and they shouldn't be doing it. Whereas things like maybe just a really low level bird dog, some really basic, what would maybe term as core exercises, were much safer, and that's what they should be doing.
Mm-hmm.
And so already there's this construction that they're creating, this sense making by just looking at that exercise. And we know that people with chronic low back pain, that external load is going to be really beneficial for them in the right amount, obviously. And spinal flexion is something that is generally very, very safe and needed to be restored. But there's a lot of fear around that. And so the more specific we are at targeting those in terms of talking about the anatomy, I think that works against us a little bit. The more general we can be and having them focus on more external cues, moving within their environment, trying to decrease that threat, the more likely we're going to start having success and moving them in the direction we want to. We're creating less barriers for us as clinicians to work against when we start considering that. Now, I just want to kind of reiterate that we can still be very, very specific in those general exercises, in that we're tailoring the amount, the context, the way that we'd be going about those general exercises very, very specifically to that individual. It's just moving away from blaming one structure and going, no, there's a whole system here. How do we get this whole system involved in this process?
Mm-hmm. And how can then therapists help those patients that are afraid of moving? We know that they have a lot of fear involved. So, do you have any tips to help those patients?
Yeah. Well, once again, it's complex, isn't it? And,
Oh, yeah.
you've had some great podcasts where, talking about the importance of therapeutic alliance. And if you don't have that therapeutic alliance, then it's really hard to create that context of safety to be exploring those threatening and, threatening movements, those things that they might be really hyper vigilant about. So I think one is, yeah, developing that relationship. And if you don't feel like you're connecting, you don't feel like they're trusting in you, then maybe that's a really nice cue for us to refer on, or to bring in someone else with their permission, obviously an open discussion with that patient or that client, so that that there is that relationship there to begin with. Second, I think which kind of goes hand in hand with that therapeutic alliance, is that communication skills, to be able to listen, to be able to know when to maybe add a little bit of information, maybe ask for permission for bringing in that information, a bit of that education, um, to kind of go about it. So you might start with a bit more education before exploring movement in some of those cases. Or in some cases, you might really have that therapeutic alliance where they trust you, that they know that you're not going to do anything that's going to damage them. You are going to be doing things that might actually be sore, but you're making sure that they're safe. And I think if we can start to couch that idea, and create that context for them to go, all right, this person, I might be sore and I might be doing things that I'm a bit afraid of, but they are making sure that there's guardrails here, that my body is structurally safe while I'm exploring these, then I'm a little bit more comfortable to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's hundreds of ways to create that safety and that trust and start to explore those really fearful movements. Peter O'Sullivan's group doing the cognitive functional therapy, they've got some really great strategies that kind of lean on exactly what we're talking about here, about creating that safety and really exposing people to those things that they're worried about, then reflecting on how the wheels did not fall off the bus just then. What else might be going on, and what was different about that situation? And then there's the education component, that other explicit sense making component as well, that I think all work together. And there's no perfect way to do it. I don't think any of my clinical interactions ever look even remotely the same. They look so different from session to session. And that's really based on how I feel I'm interacting with that individual, and where we're kind of at to how we might go about it. And it's very generally open-ended conversations to kind of guide us in that direction.
Yeah. So I think you already kind of answered some of my next questions. I was going to ask you about pain science education. We are already touching on it. So, like, what would you consider like an effective approach? like you said, sometimes you're going to have to do a little more talking before we move. Other times you need to move. So, and there is no like recipe, as you said, non-interaction is the same. So what would you consider like an effective pain science education, and how would you deliver that education, without, backfiring, or, um, or having reinforcing and, unhelpful beliefs? So how would you go about that, delivering that education and make sure, or making sure that is effective, or how do you assess that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that backfire piece is so important, isn't it? Like,
Yeah.
I, I think any of us who have, used or brought in pain science education into the clinic have experienced it to some extent, where someone's walked out probably thinking that pain's all in their head, or something along those lines, or no, whatever you're talking about, my pain's real, or something to that effect. And that's not helpful. And that's not what those key messages are. So if that's what someone's leaving with, I think that suggests that we probably haven't landed with our education well.
Mhm.
And I think to come back to what we've spoken about so far is, one, we need to listen to what that individual is going through right now. What is their current sense making? Because if we are just going to start layering in pain science education facts into that clinical session, most of them probably aren't relevant. And there's probably some nuance to those key concepts for their story that's going to be really, really important to consider. So I think if we're kind of going in gung ho and just delivering pain science education at someone, then we're probably going to hit some roadblocks 9 times out of 10. So listening, but asking those open-ended questions. So what do you think is going on? Why do you think this has been going on for so long? Really unpacking that. What have you been told before? Now, you've been told quite a few things here. With all of that, does that make sense to you? So really understanding that will give us those foundations to figure out, all right, where are the gaps in knowledge here that might be really helpful for this individual,
Mhm.
before we start just doing it. Okay. And so I think that's probably number one. Good communication, good listening, and eliciting that story in a deep way. We're talking about how it's impacting their life. We're talking about what this means to them, what that pain is, what other symptoms are going on, what else is happening in their context in the world. That all becomes really relevant information. And as I think if you're a new clinician, that can sound so overwhelming, because that's just opening up this can of worms of so many different factors. But one thing we know about pain is pain's complex. That is, lots of different factors influence this person's experience of pain and their pain intensity, the way that they respond to that pain, and they're going to engage in their recovery. But what I think is really nice about opening up that can of worms is that you're opening up a can of opportunities. There's a can of hope there. And maybe that's the way we need to kind of reimagine this, is our old school thinking of thinking that, there's a structure that goes wrong, and then that sends pain signals to your brain, and your brain, feels that pain in the body. We know that's completely wrong. There's no pain signals, nothing like that. But how beautiful was that as an idea? Is if that is how it worked, we could just go cut off that leg, or we could just remove that part, or we could do a spinal fusion. But what we see is we do all of these things, we cut off a leg, and someone still has phantom pain. What? You do your spinal fusion, and most people don't do well. We've got a condition now called failed spinal surgery. Like, it's, really quite an unhopeful way. And when you think of it like that, in that reductionistic way, we don't have any other opportunities to go down to now. It's like that body part's not even there anymore. So now we should just give up hope. It's like, absolutely not. And so coming back to this complexity idea is that if we elicit that in that conversation, now we can see that there's a whole lot of different factors that are influencing this complex person, that are influencing that neuroendocrine immune system, as it were, from sleep to diet to movement to exercise to social interactions and so on, and that I think are all very viable, within scope for most healthcare practitioners to be engaging with and considering with their approach. So that there's that element to it. And then there's also considering that pain science education isn't just what we say, but it is also what we do. So if we know that person is safe to move, but they might be sore, but we are being really overly cautious ourselves and we're being really worried, that could be reinforcing that they're more broken than they are. So just really considering our own reaction, our own response, and reflecting on that after sessions and go, what could I have done better? How did I feel during that session? Because those interactions, our responses are a whole part of that pain science education. Pain science education isn't just what we say, it is the whole context in which is occurring, from, once again, from our website, social media, to them walking through the door, to that clinical interaction, to what we say, to what we do.
Also your body language, right? Like if
All
they
right.
feel you are secure on what you're doing, you know what you're talking about, their reaction doesn't scare you. If they say, "Oh, it's hurting here," you're like, "That's fine," and you know you help them, you guide them through that process, and you feel you're giving them that security that they can trust you. You know what you're doing. I think that, makes them relax and feel safe. Because if you're like freaking out, like, oh my gosh, what's happening? Why is hurting so much? Or like, you're even like your facial expression, right?
Yeah.
Can give them doubts.
And I think that's such a good point to also consider, is that I think it's really normal for us as clinicians. Well, we know it's normal for us to feel uncertain in clinical interactions, particularly when we're, inviting in this complexity into the situation that we don't know where this is going to go. And so I think it's really normal for us to feel a little bit of like, holy shit, oh, what's next? How am I going to deal with this? But being able to, I think, acknowledge that's a real feeling that we all get, um, but also being able to sit with that and just listen and know that within you that you've got a very unique, great skill set to be able to engage with these complex factors, and that you don't have to take it all on at once, that you are just going to try and find the best few little opportunities to start with that individual that they find important and meaningful, to start working and moving forward and being explorative with it. And I think if we can be a little bit more curious rather than coming in with trying to have all the answers, where we're going to explore more with that individual, then it takes a lot of that onus off us to be trying to fix them, that we're actually facilitating now, their discovery, their recovery. Then what we already see in the data is that if we can embrace that uncertainty, we have less burnout, that we enjoy our work a whole lot more, that the patient will trust us more, and they're more likely to engage in that process of recovery. So we're probably going to have them on board more often and more engaged than what we would do if we're just trying to take all the ownership off them and try and fix them.
Yeah. And it's, help them, engage them in the treatment. Uh,
Yeah.
Sometimes I do that with my patients, like, okay, now you're going to investigate that. So you're going to report back next visit what happened. And they get engaged in the process. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and what are, do you think, the most common misconceptions about pain that you still see between therapists and how they should address that?
Yeah, yeah. You know what? I think it's changing, but one of the things I'm still seeing is, and I'd be really curious to if other listeners are still experiencing this as well, depending on where they are in the world too. But I'm still really seeing this idea that pain equals damage. that if we have pain, it is this one-to-one relationship. We damage, and that means we're doing something wrong, and we should no longer be doing that activity. That is so pervasive, at least in my community. And my community is filled with some of the greatest pain science minds, some amazing clinicians, but still by far, I'm seeing, a lot of people coming in to see me that have that belief. And those beliefs, we know, for the most part, come from healthcare clinicians. And so I think we really need to do better at helping them understand that, yes, pain can be related to tissue damage. Absolutely. We're not saying it's not. I think that's another important misconception, is there is the other end of the spectrum of saying pain's got nothing to do with tissue damage. And we know that's not the truth of the story. But it is really trying to reinforce that pain is a complex experience influenced by many, many different factors, and that tissue damage does not have to be at play for us to be experiencing pain. Nociception, so that danger detection, may likely still be at play, but it doesn't mean that our body is damaged either. So I think that's probably still the biggest one. And maybe another one on the other end of the spectrum, that pain is in the brain. Um, and I think it's come from maybe misunderstanding some, quotes from some very clever, smart people, where pain is not just in the brain. We can't have pain without a brain. Absolutely. I think that's really, really important to consider, that brain is such an important part of any experience. But we also can't have pain without a body. We can't have pain without an environment. And all of these factors are really integrated and meshed with each other. And so I think re-envisaging what pain is as this embodied experience, that is reflective of our environment outside of us, inside of us, and the processing, all of that is emerging, I think is probably a really important thing for us to be considering, when we're thinking about pain, and how we get that idea across to those who are seeking help.
Yeah, I think like that idea that there are many factors that influence pain, right? It's not just one thing or the other. So, and I think lately we've been talking a lot more about pain education. So I think it's changing. Maybe not, everybody, but I feel like that's being like one of the hot topics in these last few years.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And it's evolved so much. I mean, pain education has been around for a long time, and we've had this really big shift from, this didactic education, telling people about pain, to really sitting beside them and finding these really clever ways to help them to construct the best understanding of their world, their health, to support their recovery. So those skills around education have really, really developed, and that education in and of itself is a treatment. So getting good at doing that, I think, is really, really important. I think we quite often, and I can speak for myself here, coming out of my clinical masters many years ago, was the power is going to be in the hard skills, in the prescribing those really specific exercises, doing very specific manual therapies, and so on. To kind of going, yeah, there's actual benefit in that. But when we understand pain and complex systems that comes from learning about pain science education, that we now have a philosophy that we can couch all of our treatments and strategies in a very powerful way, to help people take on these ideas, make sense of their experience in really healthy ways that help them to move forward and live the lives that they want to be living, or at least as best they can.
And to wrap up, uh, If you could give 3 key takeaways for clinicians about language, exercise, patient beliefs, everything we've been talking about, what would that be?
Listen, just listen to the story. They're already coming in with the pieces of the puzzle, coming to see us. And maybe if we view ourselves as being able to be a facilitator of helping them to rearrange some of those pieces of the puzzle in a way that's helpful to create a really lovely picture, I think that's great. 2 is reflect on our own clinical practice, reflect on the things that we say, but also we do, thinking about, were they congruent with each other? With what I said, did what I do align with that in the mind of that person we were trying to help? Is there a way to maybe have a conversation with them to elicit what their sense making was of that? Can I maybe do that differently next time? Or was that great the way that I just went about that? And third is, I think more than anything is being kind to ourselves. So embracing that uncertainty is really hard work. Doing good pain science education is hard. Embracing complexity, it can feel really overwhelming at first. And I'd say for this is to sit with that uncertainty, to dig deeper, to learn and challenge yourself in that sweet zone, that right amount of sweet zone, to really engage with this, because I think this is, the way of the future. It helps us to make sense of all human experiences, and it's a fascinating place to be working.
No, that's great. And if people want to learn more about that, do you have any resources that you can recommend, or how they can, get started or implementing that on their day to day? What would you advise them to do?
Yeah. At NOI Group, we've got our Explain Pain courses. So we do run them live. And there's also an on-demand version that you can do in your own time. And we're actually launching that today. So the new
Oh,
one today. So that's really, really exciting, where we've got Laura Mosley, David Butler, and a bunch of our other faculty members basically teaching all of these different elements. So it's really clinically relevant, but it's doing some deep dives into some of these really interesting topics and how we can do better in the clinic with them. Lots of really cool tools. So that's just on noigroup.com. So they're great ones. But there's some other really great resources out there that are free. If you check out the Pain Revolution website, they've got some free resources, some handouts that are on just some of the essential fact sheets. So they can be fantastic for providing to a patient, going through and discussing that with them. And then we've also got a whole range of publications as well at NOI Group. So Explain Pain Supercharged, Explain Pain, and a range of handbooks for patients as well. So all based on the highest quality evidence that we've got. Most of our handbooks have been parts of randomized clinical trials with really impressive outcomes. And so they're all resources to help facilitate these discussions in the clinic as well.
lots of resources.
Absolutely.
And anything else that you want to mention that we forgot, or any final thought before we wrap up?
No, I think we've probably covered everything off, but I really appreciate your time, Ariana. It's been a lot of fun having a chat with you.
Very good. And if people want to find you or, reach out to you, is there any way that they can do so?
Yeah, they're welcome to email me and Brendan at noigroup.com, or reach out on sort of Twitter or X nowadays, which is just Brendan Mouatt, spelled Mouatt. That's the handle. Or on LinkedIn, feel free to reach out to me there as well.
Awesome. Brendan, thank you so much for your time and for, sharing all your knowledge here, helping us with this complex topic. So I appreciate you.
Thanks again, Mariana.
That's all for today's episode of PT Pro Talk. We hope you enjoyed this discussion. Be sure to follow us wherever you listen to podcasts so you'll be notified when we release future episodes. You can also join our email list at ptprotalk.com to receive updates and access new episodes. If you have ever gotten value from the show, please take a moment to leave us a 5-star review. It always makes my day and it really helps us out. If you have any guests or topics you'd like to see on the show, let us know by answering a quick survey. You can find the link in the show notes, along with more information about our guests, resources, website, and social media. Thanks again for listening, and until next time.